The table was set for 12. Diane always set it for 12, even when she only invited 8. She said it was about abundance. I used to believe her. That was before I knew she'd saved a seat for the woman sleeping with my husband. I'm standing in front of my bathroom mirror right now. It's 4:47 in the afternoon on Christmas Day, and my dress is red because I decided a long time ago that if this night was going to happen, I was going to look like I chose it. The earrings are gold, the shoes are heeled. My hands are not shaking. Diane sent the invitation 3 weeks ago. Cream cardstock, hand-addressed, the kind of effort she only makes when she wants something to feel official. I read it twice, set it on the kitchen counter, and left it there for Marcus to find. He brought it to me that evening, like it was nothing. "Mom's doing Christmas at the house. You in?" I said yes. Then I went to my home office, closed the door, and made a phone call. "The person I called is arriving at 7 p.m. tonight. Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. 7 years is long enough to stop seeing a person clearly." I met Marcus Beaumont Cole at a rooftop party in Midtown Atlanta in the summer of 2017. He was standing near the edge of the terrace with a drink he hadn't touched, looking out at the skyline, like he was calculating something. I remember thinking he had the kind of stillness that either meant depth or emptiness, and I was curious enough to find out which. We talked for 3 hours that night. He was smart in the way that feels effortless in conversation, quick with context, slow with conclusions. He asked me what I did, and when I told him I was a CPA, he didn't make the usual joke about taxes. He asked me what kind of clients I worked with. I told him high net worth individuals who preferred discretion. He nodded like that made complete sense. It was the right response. Most people would have pushed for details. I should have noted then that he already knew how to be careful with information. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. The ring was simple, a solitaire on a thin gold band, nothing that needed to announce itself. I wore it to client meetings, and nobody asked about it, which was exactly what I wanted. My work and my personal life had always run on parallel tracks, clean and separate. Marcus understood that, or I thought he did. The first 4 years of our marriage were by any honest measure good. We bought a house in Cascade Heights, 3 bedrooms, a study. I converted into a proper office, a backyard with 2 oak trees that dropped leaves every November in a way that always made the yard look like something from a catalog. Marcus traveled for work several times a year. I built my client list steadily, quietly. We had dinners with friends on Friday nights and drove to Savannah twice a year because we both loved the coast in the off-season. We did not fight often. When we did, it was about logistics schedules, whose family we were visiting, for which holiday, whether to refinance. The ordinary friction of 2 people sharing a life. Diane was always there at the edge of it. She lived 20 minutes away in Buckhead, in the house where Marcus grew up, a 5-bedroom colonial that his father Gerald had bought in 1991, when the neighborhood was still considered a stretch for a man in his position. Gerald built something real. He was a quiet man, the kind who communicated primarily through actions. A repaired fence, a check left on the kitchen counter without discussion, a hand on your shoulder when words felt insufficient. I liked him immediately. He called me Hannah without the pause that some people insert before a new name. The pause that means they're still deciding whether you belong. Gerald died 3 years into our marriage. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. He was gone 11 weeks after the diagnosis. Marcus flew home twice before the end, and I went with him. Both times sat in that Buckhead house, made coffee, and watched Diane receive visitors with the composed performance of a woman who had long rehearsed for widowhood. I do not say that cruelly. I say it because it was visible, and because Gerald, in one of his last coherent conversations, pulled my hand and said something I didn't fully understand until much later. He said, "Don't let her rewrite it." I thought he meant the grief. The story of their marriage, the version Diane would curate for the world. I nodded and told him I understood. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, like he was checking whether I actually did, then closed his eyes. After Gerald died, Diane's attention sharpened towards Marcus in a way that felt less like grief and more like recalibration. She called him every day. She developed opinions about our house, our schedule, our plans for children we hadn't decided to have yet. She began mentioning Sienna. At first, it was incidental. Sienna helped me pick out new living room curtains. Then Sienna came to church with me on Sunday. Isn't that sweet? Then, 18 months ago, at a dinner at Diane's house, where the seating had been arranged so that Sienna sat directly across from Marcus and I sat at the far end near Diane's college roommate. Sienna just started her own event planning business. Marcus, you should connect her with some people at your office. I watched Marcus say he would. I watched him not look at me when he said it. I drove home that night and sat in my car in our driveway for 6 minutes before going inside. I was not crying. I was cataloging. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives not with a single revelation, but with the accumulation of small wrongnesses. A scent, a seating arrangement, a name repeated one too many times in a register that carries just slightly more warmth than it should. I had been cataloging for 14 months by the time Diane's Christmas invitation arrived. I knew what the invitation was. It was not a dinner. It was a demonstration. Diane had decided something, and she wanted me to sit at her table and receive it. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that I had decided something too. And I had made my decision 11 months before she made hers. The oak trees in our backyard had already dropped everything by December. The yard looked clean and bare, and ready the way ground looks after something has been cleared from it on purpose. I stood at the kitchen window, looking at it the morning the invitation came, holding my coffee with both hands, and I thought, some tables are set for abundance, and some tables are set for something else entirely. I knew which one Diane had set. I just hadn't told her yet what I was bringing to it. The first thing I noticed was a receipt. Not a dramatic discovery, no lipstick on a collar, no late-night phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. Just a receipt from the Whitley Hotel bar, printed on that thin thermal paper that fades if you leave it in sunlight, folded twice, and pushed into the small inner pocket of Marcus's gray wool blazer. The blazer he'd asked me to drop at the dry cleaner on a Tuesday in October 14 months ago. I found it because I always check pockets before I drop anything off. 11 years of habit gum wrappers, parking tickets, the occasional $20 bill. I unfolded it without thinking. 1 glass of Barolo, 1 Hendrix, and tonic, $19. Tip brought it to $26. Timestamp 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Marcus had told me he was at a client dinner in Dunwoody that Thursday. He'd been home by 10:30, smelling of the cedar soap he kept in his gym bag. Not the Barolo, not the gin. I stood in our bedroom holding that receipt for a long time. The dry cleaning bag was still in my hand. I refolded the receipt exactly as I'd found it, put it back in the pocket, and dropped the blazer off that afternoon like nothing had happened. I picked it up 2 days later. The receipt was gone. Marcus had retrieved it without mentioning it. That was the moment I understood that we were no longer in the same conversation. I didn't confront him. I want to be clear about that because people always ask, why? Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you demand an answer right then? And the honest answer is that I already knew what an answer would cost me before I had enough to spend. Confrontation without leverage is just noise. I had spent my entire career advising people who had made the mistake of moving too fast, liquidating assets in panic, making decisions from emotion when the numbers hadn't finished telling their story. I was not going to do that in my own house. So I began paying attention differently, not obsessively. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of the story, where I became someone surveilling her own marriage with paranoid precision, and that is not what happened. What happened was quieter than that. I simply stopped switching off my professional mind when I walked through our front door. I had spent 12 years reading patterns for a living, discrepancies and cash flow irregularities in timing the specific texture of information that has been deliberately shaped to mislead. I turned that same attention toward my own life, and I let it run. Marcus's patterns shifted in ways that were small enough to dismiss individually and impossible to ignore collectively. He began showering immediately upon arriving home before we'd even spoken, which he'd never done consistently before. His phone, which had always lived on the kitchen counter when he was home, migrated permanently to his person pocket nightstand face down. He started going to the gym on Sunday mornings, a habit he'd attempted and abandoned twice in the past 4 years, but this time it stuck. And the sessions ran between 90 minutes and 2 hours, which was 40 minutes longer than the drive the workout and the drive back required. He became slightly more attentive to me in the weeks following what I would later identify as their meetings, more likely to ask about my day in that deliberate way that signals guilt rather than interest. More likely to suggest we try a new restaurant, more likely to reach for my hand in public. I noted all of it. I did not react to any of it. The Sunday gym sessions were confirmed by a single data point I did not go looking for. In November, 8 months after the receipt, Marcus left his gym bag unzipped on the bedroom floor, and his phone slid partially out when I moved the bag off the chair. The screen lit up with a notification, not a message, just a calendar reminder. Confirmation, Sunday, 9 a.m. No location, no name. The kind of entry that has been deliberately stripped of context. I pushed the phone back into the bag with the toe of my slipper and went downstairs to make breakfast. 3 weeks later, Diane mentioned Sienna for the first time in a context that was not incidental. We were at Diane's house for Sunday dinner, just the 3 of us, the way Diane preferred it. And she said while passing the sweet potatoes that Sienna had been going through a hard time lately and that it was good she had people around her who cared. She said it to Marcus, not to me. Marcus said, "That's good, Mom," and reached for the sweet potatoes. I watched Diane watch Marcus say it. That was when I understood that Diane was not an innocent bystander. She was a participant. And she had been one long enough to have developed a comfort with her role that she no longer bothered to fully conceal from me. I excused myself after dinner to use the restroom and stood in Diane's upstairs hallway for 90 seconds, looking at the family photographs lining the wall. There was a photo of Marcus at maybe 16, standing with Gerald at some outdoor event, both of them squinting into the sun. Gerald had his hand on Marcus's shoulder. He looked proud in the uncomplicated way of a man who has not yet been disappointed. I thought about what Gerald had said to me 3 years ago. Don't let her rewrite it. He hadn't meant the grief at all. I went back downstairs and finished my dinner. I thanked Diane for cooking. I helped clear the plates. On the drive home, I told Marcus that dinner was nice, and he said, yeah. Mom really outdid herself, and we drove the rest of the way in the particular silence of 2 people who have both decided not to say the thing they are actually thinking. When I got home, I went to my office, opened my laptop, and sent an email to a contact I had not been in touch with for almost 2 years. The subject line was 4 words, "I need a meeting." The reply came the next morning, before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. It said, "Name the time." I found the messages on a Wednesday in February, not because I went looking. I want to be precise about that. I had been paying attention for months, yes, watching, cataloging, building a picture one detail at a time, but I had made a deliberate decision not to go through Marcus's phone. Not out of some misplaced sense of trust, out of strategy. Anything I found by accessing his device without permission would be inadmissible in a legal proceeding, and more importantly, would tip him off before I was ready. I had built my entire professional life on the principle that the timing of a reveal matters as much as the reveal itself. What happened on that Wednesday was not strategy. It was a Wednesday morning in February, and Marcus was running late for work, and he left his phone on the bathroom counter next to the sink. I was in the shower. I heard it buzz twice. I heard him come back in, grab it, leave. The door clicked shut. And then I heard his car back out of the driveway, and the sound of it fade down the street. I finished my shower. I dried off. I was reaching for my moisturizer when I saw it, his secondary phone. The one I hadn't known existed until that moment. Sitting on the far edge of the counter behind the hand soap, partially hidden by the small ceramic dish where he kept his watch at night. It must have slid out of his jacket pocket when he grabbed the other one in his rush. It was a basic prepaid model. Matte black. No case. I stood there in my towel for a long moment. Then I picked it up. It was not locked. I don't know how long I stood there reading. Time moved strangely in a way I recognized from the worst moments of my professional life, the ones where a client's books revealed something so structurally wrong that you have to read it 3 times before your brain accepts that the numbers are not lying to you. The messages went back 9 months. Sienna's contact name in the phone was saved simply as S. The messages were not ambiguous. They were not the kind of thing you could interpret charitably or explain away. They were explicit, and they were frequent, and they were in several places tender in a way that was somehow worse than the explicit part, the kind of tenderness that indicates a sustained emotional investment, not just a physical one. But it was not the messages between Marcus and Sienna that made my hands go still. It was the thread above it, a separate conversation, Marcus and Diane. I scrolled up. Diane had known for 7 months. The messages made that plain. She hadn't stumbled onto the information Marcus had told her. Voluntarily. In a thread that began with Marcus saying he needed to talk to her about something, and Diane responding within 4 minutes. Their conversation had the rhythm of 2 people who had discussed this before, who had already established a shared position, and were now refining the details of it. The detail they were refining in a thread from November 3 months before I was standing in my bathroom reading it was the prenup, specifically the absence of one. Marcus and I had not signed a prenuptial agreement. At the time of our marriage, I had not yet built my client portfolio to what it became, and Marcus's income was the more substantial of the two. The decision not to sign felt in 2017 like a gesture of good faith from both sides. By 2023, it was a different calculation entirely. My portfolio had grown significantly. The assets under my management were my own business structured as an LLC, and the question of how those assets would be treated in a divorce had become, I now understood reading this thread in my bathroom. On a Wednesday morning in February, a topic of sustained interest to my husband and his mother. Diane's message from November 14th read, "The modification has to look like it came from her. She has to think it's a routine update. Get Elliot to draft something that sounds administrative." Marcus's response, "She's careful. She'll read every word." Diane, "Then make sure every word is correct, except the one that matters." I put the phone back exactly where I had found it, behind the hand soap, angled the same way, the screen facing down. I got dressed. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and drank it, looking out at the backyard, where the oak trees were still bare from winter, their branches making clean, dark lines against a white February sky. I was not shaking. I noticed that, specifically checked my hands around the coffee mug, and confirmed that they were steady. What I felt was not the hot, destabilizing shock of betrayal. That had already come and gone quietly back in October, when I found the receipt and understood what it meant. What I felt now was something colder and more clarifying, the specific feeling of a picture that has been assembling itself for months, suddenly snapping into complete resolution. I knew now what I was dealing with. Not just a husband and a woman. A coordinated effort. A plan with a legal mechanism attached to it, drafted by someone named Elliot, designed to look routine, an effort that required Marcus's mother to be not just aware, but actively directing. I finished my coffee. I rinsed the mug. I went to my office, opened my laptop, and pulled up the contact I had emailed 3 months earlier, the one who had replied within hours, the one who had said name the time. I had met with him once since then, a preliminary conversation, careful and brief, at a coffee shop in Decatur, where neither of us was likely to be recognized. I sent him a single message. It's time to move to the next step. Then I opened a separate document I had been building since November. A clean dated record of observations, timestamps, behavioral patterns, and a single scanned image of a dry cleaning receipt from the Whitley Hotel bar that I had photographed before returning the blazer 14 months ago. I added the date, the location of the secondary phone, and a 3-sentence summary of what I'd read. I saved the document. I closed the laptop. Marcus came home that evening at 6:43. He said the traffic on 285 was brutal. I said it always was on Wednesdays. He asked what was for dinner, and I told him I'd picked up soup from the place on Cascade he liked. We ate at the kitchen table with the television on in the other room, the sound carrying through the doorway like background noise in a waiting room. He never mentioned the phone, neither did I. The man I had emailed was named Arthur Beaumont, not Marcus's family. The name was a coincidence that I had noted when Gerald first introduced us years ago at a charity dinner in Piedmont Park. Arthur Beaumont, estate attorney, 68 years old at the time, semi-retired, but still carrying a small roster of clients he described as ones he couldn't bring himself to let go of. Gerald had been one of them for 30 years. Gerald had introduced us with the particular deliberateness of a man making a purposeful introduction, not a social one. Hand on my elbow. Slight pressure, the specific gesture of someone ensuring you understand that this moment matters. Arthur and I had exchanged cards that night. I had filed his in the small leather holder I kept for contacts outside my primary professional circle, the ones I was not yet sure what to do with, but knew better than to discard. I pulled that card out in November, 11 months ago, the week after the Sunday dinner, where Diane had watched Marcus confirm that he cared about Sienna's well-being. Our first meeting was coffee in Decatur a Saturday morning. A corner table at a place with enough ambient noise to make the conversation private without requiring us to lower our voices. Arthur arrived before me, already seated, already had his coffee. He was 71 now, silver-haired with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 5 decades in rooms where careless words caused irreversible damage. I sat down and told him what I knew. Not everything at that point. I didn't have the secondary phone yet, didn't have the thread with Diane. What I had was the receipt, the pattern the Sunday mornings, and the name Sienna repeated in a register that meant something it shouldn't. Arthur listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. Then he said, "Gerald called me 8 weeks before he died." I waited. He had concerns about what would happen after he was gone, specifically about Diane and what she would do with what he left, and specifically about you. He said it plainly, without drama, the way lawyers say things that would sound extraordinary coming from anyone else. Gerald had not been a man who trusted institutions over people, but he had trusted Arthur for 30 years. And in the last weeks of his life, he had used that trust to do something careful and deliberate. He had revised his estate documents. Not dramatically, the primary distributions remained largely as they had been. But he had added a provision, a secondary beneficiary clause structured to activate, under specific conditions, naming Hannah Cole, my name, my full legal name, as a 40% co-beneficiary of the liquid assets and 2 of the 4 properties in the estate. The condition for activation documented evidence of bad faith conduct by the primary executor, Diane, against the named secondary beneficiary. Arthur had been sitting on this document for 3 years, waiting to see if the condition would ever need to be triggered. Gerald said you would know when it was time, Arthur told me. He said you were the kind of person who would be certain before you moved. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the coffee shop window, Decatur was moving through a gray November Saturday. People with dogs, a stroller, a man on a bicycle navigating the intersection with patient persistence. I'm certain, I said. Arthur nodded once. He picked up his coffee. Then we have work to do. In the 3 months between that conversation and Christmas Day, I did 4 things. The first was to retain Arthur formally with a signed engagement letter, and a retainer paid from a personal account Marcus had no visibility into a legacy account from before our marriage that I had never closed and never mentioned. I am a CPA. I understand the architecture of financial privacy. I had not hidden this account out of deception. I had simply never been asked about it. There is a difference, and it would matter later. The second was to document everything with the precision I applied to client work. Dates, times, observations, the photograph of the receipt, the behavioral log I'd been building since October. After February and the secondary phone, I added a time-stamped entry describing its existence, its location, and the substance of what I had read. I did not take the phone. I did not photograph the screen. I described what I had seen in my own words, signed the entry, and had it notarized at an office in Sandy Springs, where I was not a regular client. The third was to consult quietly with a divorce attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who operated out of a small firm in Midtown and whose reputation in Atlanta's legal community was, according to 3 separate sources I trusted, built entirely on cases she had won by being more prepared than anyone in the room expected her to be. Patricia and I met twice. The second meeting lasted 3 hours. She reviewed my documentation, asked questions I had already anticipated, and confirmed that the combination of the estate provision and the documented conduct pattern created a position of considerable strength. She also confirmed what I had already calculated on my own, that the modification to our post-nuptial arrangement that Diane and Marcus had been discussing in their November thread, the administrative-looking document drafted by someone named Elliot, had never been presented to me, which meant it did not exist as a legal instrument, which meant that whatever they had planned had not yet been executed. They were still waiting for the right moment. I decided to give them one. The fourth thing I did was say yes to Christmas dinner. After I accepted Diane's invitation, I called Arthur and told him the date. He said he would arrange his schedule. I told him 7 o'clock. He said he would be there at 5 past, because arriving exactly on time had always struck him as slightly aggressive. I almost laughed. It was the first time in 11 months that something had made me feel like laughing. The week before Christmas, I continued my normal routine without variation. I went to client meetings. I answered Marcus's texts about what we were getting Diane. For Christmas, I suggested a cashmere wrap in a color I knew she would like, ordered it, had it gift wrapped, put both our names on the card. I confirmed our attendance with Diane by text on the Monday before. She responded with a single heart emoji, the kind of response that is designed to read as warm, and carries, if you know what you are looking at, a specific flavor of satisfaction. The night before Christmas Eve, I laid my red dress on the chair in our bedroom. Marcus saw it and said, "You're wearing that tomorrow," I said. I thought it felt right for the occasion. He looked at it for a moment longer than the question required. Then he said it looked nice and went to brush his teeth. I stood in front of the mirror after he turned off his bedside lamp and fell asleep. The room was dark, except for the ambient light coming through the curtains from the street outside. I looked at myself, not vain, not performing, just looking, and I thought about Gerald in that hospital room, his hand thin and warm around mine, his eyes checking whether I actually understood. I understood now. I understood everything. I turned off the lamp on my side and got into bed. and slept without difficulty the way you sleep when you have done every piece of work that needed doing, and there is nothing left to prepare. Tomorrow was just the delivery. We arrived at Diane's house at 4:15. I had suggested 4 o'clock to Marcus, and he had predictably taken 15 minutes longer than necessary to find his keys. I had been ready since 3:45, sitting in the living room in my red dress with my coat folded across my lap and my bag on the cushion beside me, watching the oak trees in the backyard through the glass door. The sky was the particular flat gray of Atlanta in late December. Not cold enough for drama, just cold enough to be serious. Marcus came downstairs adjusting his cufflinks and stopped when he saw me sitting there, already waiting. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly. He said, "You look nice." I said, "Thank you. Your keys are on the hook by the door." Diane's house in Buckhead was lit from every window when we pulled into the driveway. She had hung a wreath on the door the size of a small bicycle wheel, studded with magnolia leaves and gold ribbon, the kind of wreath that requires a decision and a budget. The driveway already held 2 other cars. I recognized her neighbor Barbara and Barbara's husband, and a third car. I did not recognize a silver Audi A5 with a paper tag still in the rear window. I noted the Audi. I said nothing about it. Diane answered the door in a burgundy wrap dress and 3-inch heels. Her silver locks pinned up earrings that caught the light from the entryway chandelier. She kissed Marcus on the cheek first, then turned to me with a smile that was wide and warm and calibrated in the way of a woman who had rehearsed its sincerity. "Hannah, baby, you look beautiful. Come in, it's cold." She took my coat. She complimented my dress. She steered us toward the living room where Barbara and her husband were already seated with drinks and a charcuterie board that had been arranged with the kind of effort that announces itself. The Christmas tree in the corner was 8 feet tall and decorated in gold and white, not a single ornament out of place. Nat King Cole was coming through the Sonos at a volume designed to feel festive without interrupting conversation. Everything in the room was performing. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from the tray Diane offered. She knew I didn't drink at family events, had known for 7 years, and found a seat on the settee near the window where I could see both the door to the hallway and the front door simultaneously. A professional habit. I like to know where the exits are and where things will come from. Marcus sat beside me for approximately 4 minutes before Diane called him into the kitchen to help with something. He went without hesitation, touching my knee briefly as he stood the guilt gesture I had cataloged it dozens of times by now, and I watched him disappear through the doorway. Barbara asked me about work. I told her it was going well. She told me about her daughter's new apartment in Charlotte. I listened with genuine attention because Barbara was a decent woman who had no idea what she was sitting in the middle of, and she deserved real engagement. At 4:47, I heard the front door. I did not turn my head immediately. I finished the sentence I was in the middle of, with Barbara nodded at something she said, and then let my gaze move naturally toward the entryway, as if drawn by the sound of new arrivals. Sienna came through the door carrying a white bakery box tied with red twine. She was wearing a cream-colored wrap dress. I noted this with a flatness that surprised me the way you note the weather. And her hair was pressed and curled. And she had the slightly elevated energy of someone who has prepared carefully for a room they are not supposed to belong in, but have decided to walk into anyway. She was pretty in a way that was unambiguous. I want to be honest about that. I had spent 11 months building a case, and not once had I allowed myself to use her as a convenient object of uncomplicated anger because she was 29 years old, and the architecture of what had happened here was not primarily her construction. Diane came out of the kitchen, and the embrace she gave Sienna was immediate and full, both arms a hand on the back of her head, the specific warmth of a welcome that has been anticipated. "You made it, sweetheart. Let me take that." Sienna handed over the bakery box. Diane held it up. She made her grandmother's rum cake from scratch. Barbara made an appreciative sound. Her husband reached for more charcuterie. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. The 3 seconds that followed were the only moment of the evening where I saw him come close to losing his composure entirely. His eyes went from Sienna to me in a single movement, and something happened in his face. Not guilt, exactly something more complicated and less flattering than guilt. The look of a man who has been managing 2 separate realities and has just found them in the same room, both of them looking back at him. I smiled at him. Pleasantly. The way you smile at someone across a room when there is nothing in particular to communicate. He smiled back. It did not reach his eyes. Diane brought Sienna into the living room and made introductions as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world. Barbara greeted her warmly. Sienna sat in the armchair across from the settee where I was still seated, and for a moment, just a moment, her eyes met mine. She looked away first. Dinner was served at 6. The table was everything Diane's tables always were: linen cloth, crystal glasses, centerpiece of white roses and pine, the good china that came out 4 times a year. She had cooked for 11 hours. The food was exceptional. It always was. Whatever else Diane was, she cooked with real love, the kind that doesn't perform. And I had always respected that specifically. I ate. I participated in conversation. I asked Barbara's husband about the renovation they were doing on their screened porch. I responded when spoken to. I laughed twice at things that were genuinely funny. Marcus ate without appetite. I could see it from where I sat. He was moving food around, more than consuming it, refilling his wine glass at intervals that communicated something to anyone paying attention. Diane, at the head of the table, was magnificent. She held the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had been hosting for 40 years, drawing out each guest, steering conversation away from anything that might create friction, keeping the energy at exactly the temperature she wanted it. At one point, she reached over and touched Sienna's hand when Sienna said something about her grandmother's recipe, and the gesture was so natural, so maternal, that Barbara visibly responded to it with warmth. It was seamless. It was a masterclass. I gave her that. Then at 6:48, she did the thing I had been waiting for. She looked down the table at me, then at Sienna, then at the room generally, with the expression of a woman about to say something that she has decided deserves saying in front of witnesses. She set down her wine glass. She smoothed the linen beside her plate. "I just want to say," she began, and the table quieted the way tables do when the hostess signals that something is coming, "that I am so grateful for everyone here tonight. Family, and the people who become family." She looked at Sienna with a warmth that was not ambiguous. "Sienna, you are basically family to me. To all of us. I want you to know that." Barbara said, "Aw." Her husband raised his glass. Marcus looked at his plate. I looked at Diane. She met my eyes across the length of her table and held them for just a moment, long enough to make sure I had understood the declaration, long enough to confirm that it had been intended for me, specifically. It was a beautiful performance, patient and deliberate, and staged with the confidence of a woman who had decided she had already won. I held her gaze without expression for exactly as long as she held mine. Then I looked down at my plate and cut a small piece of the roast she had spent hours preparing, and put it in my mouth and chewed it slowly. It was genuinely excellent. I checked the time on the thin gold watch on my wrist. 6:51. Arthur would be here in 13 minutes. The doorbell rang at 7:04. I know the exact time, because I had been watching the watch on my wrist with the specific attention of someone waiting for a flight, not anxious, just precise. 6:51 when Diane made her declaration. 6:58 when Marcus excused himself to use the restroom and came back looking like he had spent the intervening 7 minutes deciding something and arriving at no conclusion. 7:02 when Diane began collecting the dinner plates with Sienna's help, the two of them moving around the table in a choreography of domestic familiarity that had clearly been practiced. 7:04 when the bell rang. Diane looked up from the stack of plates in her hands with the mild surprise of a woman who was not expecting anyone else. Who could that be? She said it to the room, conversationally, the way you say things when you're not concerned. I was already standing. "I'll get it," I said. I invited someone too. The room processed this in the particular way of rooms where something unexpected has been said in a completely ordinary tone. Barbara looked up. Her husband paused mid-reach for his wine glass. Sienna went still near the sideboard, a serving dish in both hands. Marcus turned from the window where he had been standing and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, not guilt, not calculation. Something rawer than both of those, something that was almost recognition. I walked to the front door. I opened it. Arthur Beaumont was standing on Diane's front porch in a charcoal overcoat, a burgundy scarf, and the unhurried expression of a man who had spent 50 years arriving in rooms where he was not expected and leaving them permanently altered. He was carrying a slim leather briefcase in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. Thick clasp fastened his initials embossed in the lower left corner in the restrained way of someone who uses monograms to identify, not to impress. He was 71 years old, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had known Gerald Beaumont Cole for 30 years and had driven across Atlanta on Christmas evening because a promise made to a dying man was still a promise. "Hannah," he said. Quietly, a nod. "Arthur," I said. "Thank you for coming. Please come in." I stepped aside. He walked through Diane's front door into the entryway, his shoes making the particular sound of good leather on hardwood, and I closed the door behind him. I heard Diane before I saw her. She had come from the dining room into the hallway, still holding a serving dish, and she stopped at the threshold of the entryway with the frozen quality of a person whose body has registered something before their mind has caught up to it. "Arthur." His name in her mouth was not a greeting. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a word that has suddenly become dangerous. "Diane," Arthur said, pleasantly. "Beautiful home. You've done things with the entryway. The wainscoting is new." She did not answer the question about the wainscoting. "What are you doing here?" "I was invited," he said, with the simple clarity of a man who has never found it necessary to apologize for his presence in a room. He glanced briefly at me, then back at Diane. "I hope that's all right." It was not all right. I could see that plainly. The color in Diane's face had changed in a way that her burgundy dress could not compensate for, and her grip on the serving dish had shifted both hands, now knuckles carrying the weight of something that needed steadying. She looked at me. I looked back at her. Then I gestured toward the dining room. "Should we sit?" The dining room had the quality of a stage set between scenes when we walked back in. Everything in its place, the candles still burning, the crystal still catching the light, but the people in it repositioned by the few minutes that had elapsed. Barbara and her husband were seated again, sensing correctly that something was happening that they should be still for. Sienna was standing near the sideboard, the serving dish no longer in her hands, her arms at her sides in the particular stillness of someone who has decided the safest posture is the smallest one. Marcus was standing at the head of the table. He saw Arthur and went the color of the linen tablecloth. Arthur walked into the room without hurrying and chose the chair to my left, the chair that had been empty all evening, the one Diane had set as part of her abundance display, the one that had been waiting without either of us knowing what it was waiting for. He set his briefcase on the floor beside him and placed the manila envelope on the table in front of him, clasped side-up initials facing outward. He did not open it yet. He looked around the table with the calm of a man who has sat in more difficult rooms than this one and found them all navigable. "Please," he said to the room generally, "don't let me interrupt the evening." Nobody moved to continue the evening. Diane sat down at the head of the table with the controlled precision of a woman who has decided that composure is the only remaining asset available to her. She set her hands flat on the linen on either side of her plate. She looked at Arthur. "Arthur, whatever this is." "Gerald asked me to be here," Arthur said. The room went completely quiet. Not the conversational quiet of a pause or the social quiet of a moment that requires someone to speak next. The specific quiet of a room in which something has been said that has changed the atmosphere in a way that cannot be unchanged. "Gerald has been gone for 3 years, Diane said. Her voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a woman managing something at significant cost. "Yes," Arthur said. "He has." He was also a meticulous man who understood that some things take time to arrive at the right moment. He rested one hand on the manila envelope without opening it. He revised his estate documents 8 weeks before he died. I prepared them. He signed them in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary. They are fully executed and legally binding in the state of Georgia. Diane's left hand moved slightly on the tablecloth. A small involuntary movement, the kind the body makes when the mind is absorbing something it did not budget for. "I was not informed of any revision," she said. "No," Arthur said. "You weren't. Gerald was specific about that." Marcus pulled out the chair nearest to him and sat down. Not deliberately, his legs had made the decision for him. Arthur undid the clasp on the envelope. He did not make a production of it. He simply opened it with the practiced efficiency of a man who has opened documents in consequential rooms for 50 years. And he removed a set of papers crisp bound with a simple binder clip, the top page bearing the letterhead of Arthur's firm, and he set them on the table in front of him. "Gerald Beaumont Cole," Arthur said, "revised his estate to include a secondary beneficiary clause naming Hannah Cole, now Hannah Beaumont Cole by marriage, as a 40% co-beneficiary of the liquid assets and properties listed on pages 4 through 6, to be activated upon documented evidence of bad faith conduct by the primary executor toward the named secondary beneficiary." He looked up from the document and across the table at Diane, with the expression of a man delivering information, not judgment. "I have that documentation," he said. "It is substantial." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. On the 5th second, Diane's wine glass, a full pour of red, the good Cabernet she brought out only for occasions she considered worthy, went over. Not thrown. Her hand caught the stem, reaching for something to hold, and the glass simply tipped, and the wine moved across the white linen tablecloth in the slow, deliberate way of liquid that has all the time in the world. Nobody reached for a napkin. Nobody moved at all. Arthur looked at the spreading stain with the equanimity of a man who has seen worse things ruin better tablecloths. And he turned the page. Arthur turned 3 pages before he spoke again. He did it without performance, the quiet, methodical page-turning of a man who knows exactly where he is going and sees no reason to rush the arrival. The candles on the table were still burning. Nat King Cole had stopped somewhere during the walk from the entryway to the dining room, and nobody had restarted it. And the silence in the room now had a texture that music would have ruined. Diane had not moved to clean up the wine. The stain had reached the edge of her plate and stopped there, held by the raised rim of the china. A dark border. She was looking at Arthur's hands on the document with the expression of a woman who has spent 63 years being the most prepared person in any room she entered, and has just encountered for perhaps the first time a preparation that exceeded her own. Marcus was sitting with both forearms on the table, his wineglass pushed slightly away his eyes, moving between Arthur and his mother in the rapid, unsettled way of a man trying to read a situation that is moving faster than his ability to manage it. Sienna had not sat back down. She was still standing near the sideboard, slightly behind the sightline of the table, her arms crossed loosely at her waist. She had the quality of a person who has understood with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in rooms you are never supposed to be in, that what is happening has nothing to do with her, and everything to do with her simultaneously. Barbara and her husband were seated and still and silent, with the admirable self-possession of guests who understand that the correct behavior in this moment is invisibility. I was sitting with my hands in my lap, my back straight. My red dress doing exactly what I had needed it to do tonight, making me impossible to overlook. Impossible to diminish, impossible to pretend, was not in the room. Arthur found his page. "The documentation I referenced," he said, setting the papers flat and looking up, "covers 3 categories of conduct." He set it to the table. Professionally. The way he might have addressed a conference room of opposing counsel. The first is a sustained pattern of social conduct designed to isolate the secondary beneficiary from the primary family unit and introduce a third party as a replacement figure within that unit, documented across a period of approximately 18 months through contemporaneous written records maintained by the secondary beneficiary herself. Diane said nothing. "The second," Arthur continued, "is a recorded telephone communication in which the primary executor makes explicit reference to her awareness of an extramarital relationship involving her son and a third party, and expresses not concern, but strategic interest in how that relationship might be leveraged to affect the secondary beneficiary's legal standing within the marriage." Marcus's head came up. "The third," Arthur said, and here his voice shifted by a degree, not louder, not softer, but more deliberate. The way a careful man's voice shifts when he arrives at the part of the document that matters most is a written communication chain in which the primary executor and her son discuss a coordinated effort to present the secondary beneficiary with a modified post-nuptial agreement drafted to appear administrative in nature but structured to significantly reduce her asset protections in the event of marital dissolution. He set the papers down. "The written communication chain includes the name of the attorney retained to draft the modified agreement, the specific language strategy discussed, and a timeline for its presentation." The room was so quiet I could hear the candle nearest to me burning the faint, almost inaudible sound of a wick doing its work. Marcus pushed back from the table, not standing, just pushing back, creating distance between himself and the surface, as if the table itself had become something he needed to be further from. He looked at his mother. Not at me, not at Arthur, at Diane. "Mom." One word, the specific desolation of a grown man saying his mother's name when he has understood for the first time the full shape of what he allowed her to do on his behalf. Diane did not look at him. She was looking at Arthur with the focused, unwavering attention of a woman who has decided that the only remaining move available to her is to find the flaw in the structure, the procedural error, the point of leverage she can use to dismantle what is in front of her before it fully assembles. "Those communications were private," she said. "How they were obtained is not a question for this table," Arthur said with a patience that was not unkind. "It is a question for the proceeding that will follow from this. What I can tell you, Diane, is that Gerald was very specific about what he wanted protected, and very specific about what he believed you were capable of when protecting it conflicted with your other interests. He said her name the way you say the name of someone you have known for 30 years and are no longer willing to pretend you do not see clearly. He loved you," Arthur said. "He said that explicitly. He also knew you." Diane's jaw moved. A small, precise movement, the kind the face makes when it is managing something the body wants to release and the mind has decided it will not. She looked for just a moment like what she was, a 63-year-old woman sitting at the table she had set with her own hands in the house she had decorated for a performance that had just been interrupted by a man her late husband had sent from 3 years in the past. Then she looked at me, It was the first time all evening that she had looked at me, without the architecture of the performance in place, without the warmth calibrated for the room, without the smile that announced its own sincerity. She looked at me the way people look at each other, when everything else has been stripped away, and there is nothing left between them but the truth of what has happened. I looked back at her. I did not look away. I did not look triumphant. I did not look angry. I looked at her the way you look at someone you have studied carefully for a long time and understand completely and are no longer afraid of. She was the first to look away. Arthur reached into the briefcase beside his chair and produced a second document, thinner, a single folded page, and slid it across the table toward Marcus without standing. "This is a notice of intent to activate the secondary beneficiary clause," he said. "It initiates a 30-day review period during which the estate's independent trustee, not Diane, as that would be a conflict, will assess the documentation and confirm activation. You are both being notified tonight as a matter of legal courtesy." Marcus looked at the folded page in front of him and did not touch it. "There's also the matter of the post-nuptial modification," Arthur continued. "Since it was never executed, it carries no legal weight. However, the conspiracy to present it under false pretenses is itself actionable, and I expect Miss Osei's office will address it thoroughly." Marcus's head turned toward me at the name. Patricia Osei. He knew it. Atlanta's legal community was not large at the level where it mattered, and Patricia Osei's name carried weight in it that was not quiet. "You have a divorce attorney," he said. It was not a question. It had the quality of a man saying aloud something he has just understood and needed to hear in his own voice to confirm it was real. "I have had one for several months," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since sitting back down at the table. My voice sounded to my own ears exactly as I intended it to, even clear without heat. Marcus looked at me for a long moment. The candles between us were burning low. Now the wax pooled the light softer and less certain than it had been an hour ago. He opened his mouth. He closed it. There was nothing to say that would have changed the shape of the room. A sound came from near the sideboard, small, deliberate, the soft percussion of a clasp being closed. I turned. Sienna had her bag on her shoulder. She looked at no one specifically, not at Marcus, not at Diane, not at me. She looked at the middle distance of the room with the expression of a 29-year-old woman who has arrived at a full and complete understanding of where she is and what she is in the middle of, and has made the only decision available to a person with that understanding. She walked to the doorway. She paused there for just a moment, not dramatically, not looking back, just the natural pause of a body moving through a threshold. Then she was gone. The front door opened, closed. The sound of the silver Audi starting in the driveway carried faintly through the dining room window, and then faded, and then was gone entirely. The candle nearest to Diane guttered once in some draft none of us had felt, and steadied itself and kept burning. Barbara and her husband left at 7:43. I know because I watched the clock on the mantelpiece in the living room from where I was sitting, and the departure was so careful, so deliberately unobtrusive, that it required its own timestamp to feel real. Barbara had stood up from the table approximately 4 minutes after Sienna left, touched her husband's arm in the specific way of a woman communicating an entire conversation through a single point of contact, and said to the room that they had promised her daughter a call and should get going. She hugged me at the door with a warmth that carried no performance in it whatsoever, just 2 arms, and a genuine human acknowledgement that she had witnessed something and was choosing with grace not to comment on it. Her husband shook Arthur's hand. He did not shake Marcus's. Then they were gone, and the house was 4 people and the remains of a Christmas dinner and a wine stain on white linen that had dried to the color of a bruise. What happened next did not happen all at once. It happened the way structural failures happen, not a single catastrophic break, but a sequence of smaller ones, each following from the last, with the cold logic of cause and effect, the whole thing moving with a momentum that no one in the room had the standing to stop. Diane spoke first. She had been sitting at the head of her table for 11 minutes, since Sienna left her hands still flat on the linen, her composure still technically intact, in the way that a cracked surface is still technically intact before it gives. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, and it was aimed at Arthur, and it had the quality of a woman making one final attempt to locate a door that is no longer there. Gerald's intention was never to be used as a weapon against this family, she said. Whatever he wrote, whatever you have in that envelope, he loved his son. He would not have wanted this. Arthur looked at her with the patience of a man who has heard many versions of this argument in many rooms and has never found it persuasive. Gerald's intention, Arthur said, was to protect someone he believed would need protecting. He said specifically, and I'm quoting from a recorded conversation, Diane, so I'm not editorializing, that he was not worried about what Hannah would do with what he left her. He was worried about what you would do to her before she could receive it. The thing that happened to Diane's face in the 3 seconds that followed was not anger. Anger would have been more manageable. What moved across her face was something older and more complicated than anger. The specific anguish of a woman hearing her late husband's private assessment of her character read back to her in her own dining room by the man her husband trusted with it. She pressed her lips together. She looked down at the tablecloth. Marcus, who had been sitting with a folded notice of intent untouched in front of him since Arthur slid it across the table, picked it up. He unfolded it slowly. He read it. The reading took longer than the document's length required, which told me he was reading it more than once, the way you read something when you are hoping the second pass will reveal a different meaning than the first. It did not. He set it back down. Hannah, my name in his mouth on this particular evening, had a quality it had never carried before, stripped of the easy familiarity of 7 years, stripped of the guilt management register I had cataloged for 14 months. Just the word. Just my name. The sound of a man addressing someone he no longer knows how to address. I need you to understand, he started. Marcus, I said. He stopped. I do understand, I said. That's the difficulty. He looked at me for a long moment. The low candlelight caught the side of his face, and for a fraction of a second I could see the man I had met on that rooftop in Midtown in the summer of 2017, standing near the edge looking out at the skyline. Calculating. I had been curious about whether the stillness meant depth or emptiness. I had my answer. It had just taken 7 years to arrive in full. The modification, he said. The document Elliot drafted, I never showed it to you. I never. You discussed it with your mother for 6 weeks, I said. The intent existed. The preparation existed. The execution is a formality. I wasn't going to go through with it. The room did not dignify that with a response. Not me, not Arthur, not even Diane, who had the look of a woman who had stopped trying to manage the narrative and was now simply sitting inside its consequences. Marcus heard the silence and understood it. He pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the window that looked out over Diane's back garden, bare in December, the rose bushes cut back to their canes, the outdoor furniture stacked and covered for winter. He stood there with his back to the room the way he had stood at the edge of that rooftop terrace 9 years ago, and I thought some people return to the same posture their whole lives because they never resolved the thing that put them there. The recordings, Diane said. Her voice had changed. The control was still there, but it was thinner now, structural rather than natural, the kind of control that requires active maintenance. The communications between Marcus and myself, those were private family conversations. Any attorney worth their license will argue. Patricia Osei, Arthur said pleasantly, is worth considerably more than her license. I have known her for 11 years. I would not be concerned about her ability to address that argument. Diane closed her eyes. It was a small gesture, barely visible. But in 63 years of watching her perform perfect composure through every difficulty her life had delivered, I'd never once seen Diane close her eyes at a dinner table. It lasted 2 seconds. When she opened them, she was looking at me. Not the calibrated warmth, not the declaration from earlier in the evening. The Sienna is basically family performance aimed down the length of her own table. She was looking at me with something that was underneath everything, almost recognition. "Gerald told you," she said. Not a question. "Not everything," I said. "Enough." She was quiet for a moment. "He always thought I would go too far," she said. And something in the way she said it, not defensive, not justifying, just the flat statement of a woman arriving at the end of a story she had been telling herself for years, made it the most honest thing Diane had said all evening. Possibly the most honest thing she had said in the 3 years since Gerald died. "He was right," I said. She did not argue with that. Arthur gathered his documents at 8:15. He was efficient about it. Papers back into the envelope clasp, refastened briefcase clicked shut. He stood and buttoned his overcoat and looked around Diane's dining room one final time with the expression of a man making a quiet inventory of a place he may not see again. He shook my hand at the door. "Gerald would have been glad," he said quietly. "Not about any of this specifically. About you." I nodded. I did not trust myself to say anything that wouldn't cost me something I wasn't prepared to spend in Diane's entryway. He walked to his car, a dark sedan parked at the curb, unhurried the same way he did everything, and drove away into the Atlanta night. I stood in the open doorway for a moment after his taillights disappeared. The air was cold and still. The neighborhood was the particular quiet of Christmas evening, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone is finally inside and the day has given everything it had to give. Diane's wreath was still on the door beside me, the magnolia leaves and gold ribbon unmoved by any of it. I went back inside. Marcus was in the entryway with his coat on and his keys in his hand. We looked at each other across Diane's foyer. The hardwood floors Gerald had refinished in 2009, the family photographs on the wall, the chandelier casting its warm light over all of it. "I'll get my things from the house this week," he said. "Patricia's office will send over the filing," I said. "Probably Thursday." He nodded. He looked down at his keys. He looked back up. "I'm sorry, Hannah." I believed him. That was the complicated part. I believed the apology was genuine, and it changed nothing, and we both understood that simultaneously. "I know," I said. He walked out. I heard his car start. I heard it pull out of the driveway and move down the street and turn at the corner and disappear. I went back to the dining room. Diane was still at the head of her table. The wine stained dry now on the linen, the candles burned to their last half-inch, the remains of the meal she had spent 11 hours preparing, arranged around her in the candlelight like a still life of something that used to be one thing and was now irrevocably another. She looked up when I came in. I began clearing the plates. She watched me for a moment. Then, without a word, she picked up the serving dish nearest to her and carried it to the kitchen. We cleared the table together in silence, not the hostile silence of two people refusing to speak, but the particular silence of two people who have said everything that needed saying and are now simply moving through the aftermath of it together, because there is no one else left in the room to do it. It took 11 minutes. When we were done, I folded the stained tablecloth carefully and set it on the counter. Diane stood at the kitchen sink looking out at her dark backyard. The outdoor furniture under its winter covers. The rose bushes cut to their canes. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. "Good night, Diane," I said from the kitchen doorway. She did not turn from the window. "Good night, Hannah," she said. I let myself out. The first call came at 9:17 the next morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my own house with my second cup of coffee, still in the oversized sweatshirt I had slept in. The red dress hung carefully in the closet, the heeled shoes on the rack below it. The house was the particular quiet of a space from which something has recently been subtracted. Not empty exactly, just recalibrated the way a room feels after furniture has been moved, and the light falls differently on walls that haven't changed. Marcus had not come home the night before. I had driven myself back to Cascade Heights, changed, washed my face, and slept for 7 hours without interruption. The sleep had the quality I had predicted, deep and uncomplicated, the sleep of someone who has finished a long piece of work and set it down. The call was from Patricia Osei. "I heard it went well," she said. She did not explain how she had heard. "It went as planned," I said. "Arthur called me at 9. He's filing the activation notice with the trustee this morning." A pause, the brief, efficient pause of a woman moving through a checklist. "I'm filing the dissolution petition Thursday. I want you to come in Wednesday afternoon to review the asset schedule one more time before I submit." 2 o'clock, I said. 2 o'clock, she confirmed. "Hannah." "Yes." "You did the hard part already. The rest is paperwork." I thanked her and set the phone down on the table and looked out through the glass door at the backyard. The oak trees were still bare. A single bird was sitting on the higher branch of the left one, not moving, just occupying its place in the winter morning, with the uncomplicated commitment of a creature that does not require the landscape to be anything other than what it is. I watched it for a while. The paperwork, as Patricia had framed it, began moving with the quiet efficiency of a process that has been thoroughly prepared. Thursday morning at 9:41, Patricia's office. Filed the dissolution petition with the Fulton County Superior Court. The filing included the full asset schedule, the Cascade Heights house, the joint accounts, Marcus's deferred compensation, and the LLC structure that housed my client portfolio, clearly documented as a pre-existing entity with premarital origins, not subject to equitable distribution. It included a formal request for temporary exclusive occupancy of the marital home, pending resolution. It included, as an attachment, a preliminary summary of the post-nuptial modification conspiracy, framed not as the central claim, but as context establishing the bad faith conduct that would be relevant to any arguments Marcus's attorney might raise about asset treatment. Marcus received the filing through his attorney, a man named Dennis Hare, who operated out of a firm in Midtown that handled primarily corporate matters, and whose experience in contentious marital dissolution was, according to Patricia, limited enough to be a meaningful disadvantage. Patricia had told me this without editorializing. She had simply noted it as a relevant variable. Marcus called me 4 hours after the filing. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 40 seconds long and said in essence that he wanted to talk, that he didn't want this to become adversarial, that he thought they could work something out directly. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has reviewed his position and discovered it is considerably weaker than he had understood it to be. I did not call back. I forwarded the voicemail to Patricia's office. The estate trustee, a firm out of Buckhead that Gerald had specified by name. In the revised documents, a choice that, in retrospect, demonstrated Gerald's understanding that Diane's influence in Atlanta's financial community was extensive enough to require a specifically named independent counterweight completed its 30-day review in 26 days. The activation notice was confirmed on January 20th. Arthur called me himself to tell me. He said it in 2 sentences: the clause had been activated and the relevant assets and properties would be transferred into a separate holding structure in my name within 60 days pending standard procedural requirements. I said thank you. He said Gerald would have called it overdue. The 40%. I want to be precise about what that meant because the numbers matter. And I spent my career insisting that numbers be allowed to tell their complete story rather than the edited version that serves a particular narrative. Gerald Beaumont Cole had been in the quiet, undemonstrative way of a man who communicated primarily through actions considerably wealthier than the version of himself he presented to the world. The Buckhead house alone carried a market value that had appreciated significantly since 1991. There were 2 additional properties, a rental building in West Midtown and a commercial space in Decatur that had been leased to the same tenant for 11 years. There was a brokerage account conservatively managed that had compounded over 30 years into something substantial. There was a life insurance policy of which Diane was the primary beneficiary, and which was entirely unaffected by the revised estate documents. Gerald had been careful. He had not taken from Diane what was Diane's. He had simply ensured that what he wanted to give to me could not be intercepted. My 40%, once the transfer completed, represented a financial position that was independent of Marcus, independent of the dissolution proceedings, independent of anything Diane could do or had already done. It was not a windfall. It was a foundation, the specific kind of foundation a careful man builds when he understands that the person he is building it for will know how to use it. I sat with the numbers for 2 evenings in my home office going through the documents Arthur had sent, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, not satisfaction, not relief, but something quieter and more complicated. Gratitude. The specific gratitude of someone who has been seen clearly by another person and has discovered after the fact the full weight of what that seeing was worth. Gerald had known. He had not known the specifics, the receipt, the secondary phone. The November thread sienna in a cream-wrapped dress carrying a bakery box through his wife's front door. He had not known the particular shape the story would take, but he had known Diane well enough to understand that a shape like this was possible, and he had known me well enough to understand that, when it arrived, I would need a foundation that could not be taken, not a rescue that could be refused. He had built it 3 years before I needed it. He had trusted me to find my way to it. The dissolution was finalized in the 2nd week of March. Marcus and Dennis Hare had attempted 3 separate arguments in the intervening weeks, each one addressed by Patricia with the patient, precise efficiency of a woman who had anticipated all 3 and prepared for them before the filing date. The post-nuptial conspiracy summary had performed exactly the function Patricia had intended, not as a claim that required its own litigation, but as a weight in the room that made Marcus's negotiating position structurally untenable from the first session. The final settlement gave me the Cascade Heights house, my LLC assets clean and undisputed, and a cash settlement that reflected without argument the 7 years I had contributed to a household whose stability had funded Marcus's professional advancement. Marcus kept his deferred compensation and his car and a joint account that had been his primary operating account for years, and that contained at the time of settlement considerably less than it had contained 12 months earlier, for reasons that were his to account for. He signed the documents on a Tuesday morning. Patricia called me at 11:47. "It's done," she said. "Thank you, Patricia," I said. "Call me if you need anything," she said. "But I don't think you will." Diane called me once. It was a Sunday morning in February, 3 weeks before the dissolution was final, early enough that I was still in bed. I saw her name on the screen, and I lay there for the 4 rings it took her to reach my voicemail, and then I set the phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling. I listened to the voicemail an hour later, sitting in my office with coffee. She spoke for 90 seconds. She did not apologize. Diane was not constructed for direct apology, and I had understood that for 7 years. What she did instead was something I had not anticipated. She talked about Gerald. About the early years of their marriage, when Gerald had been building his business, and she had been building their home, and the world had felt, she said, like something that was genuinely theirs to shape. She said Gerald had always seen things in people potential. She called it the specific kind of potential that needs protecting, that she had sometimes resented, because it reminded her of her own failure to see those things first. She did not say my name. She said, "You once, near the end, I know you loved him too." Then she said goodbye, and the voicemail ended. I sat with it for a long time. I did not call back. There was nothing to say that would have served either of us. But I saved the voicemail, not as evidence, not as documentation, just as a record. The kind you keep not because you expect to revisit it, but because you understand on the day it arrives that it represents something that will not come again. The oak trees in the backyard were beginning to bud by the time the dissolution was final. Small and green and unhurried the way things come back after they have been down to their roots. I stood at the glass door the morning after Patricia called and looked at them, my backyard, my trees, my house. And I thought about a man I had known for 6 years who had communicated primarily through actions and had left me the most complete action of his life without ever once explaining it. I thought he knew I would find my way to it. I thought he was right. Spring came to Atlanta the way it always does, not gradually, not with any particular announcement, but suddenly and completely, as if the city had simply decided overnight that winter had gone on long enough. By the second week of April, the dogwoods were out along the streets of Cascade Heights, white and pink against the new green of the neighborhood, and the oak trees in my backyard had gone from bare to fully leafed in what felt like a single week, the way they always did, filling the yard with the dense layered shade that made summer in that backyard feel like a separate climate from the rest of the city. I had repainted the study, not dramatically the same warm white it had always been, but fresh, the old coat having accumulated 7 years of minor scuffs, and the particular patina of a room that has been lived in heavily. I had moved the desk to face the window instead of the wall. A small change that altered the quality of every morning I spent in that room, the light coming in from the yard rather than at my back. I was sitting at that desk on a Thursday morning in mid-April when my phone rang. Not Patricia, not Arthur. A client, one of my longest-standing ones, a woman named Reeves, who had been with me for 9 years, and who called every quarter to go over her portfolio with a kind of calm, informed attention that made her one of the most genuinely pleasant professional relationships I had. We talked for 40 minutes. I made 2 recommendations. She asked 3 questions that were better than most people's 5, and we agreed to reconvene in July. After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the April light coming through the window. The portfolio had grown in the first quarter. Not dramatically. I did not work with clients who wanted dramatic, who confused volatility with progress, but steadily in the compounding, incremental way that reflects genuine underlying strength rather than performed confidence. I had taken on 2 new clients in March, both referrals, both the kind of quiet, serious people who arrive through other quiet, serious people, and who understand instinctively that the work I do is not about spectacle. My practice was mine. Completely and unambiguously mine, in a way it had always technically been, but now felt differently, the way a thing you have always owned feels different once you have defended it. I went to Gerald's grave on a Saturday in late April, Westview Cemetery on the west side of the city, one of the oldest in Atlanta, the kind of place that has accumulated enough history to feel like ground that knows something. Gerald's headstone was simple the way everything about Gerald had been simple. His name, his dates, a single line. He had chosen himself that I had not known about until Arthur mentioned it when the stone was placed. He built what he meant to last. I stood there for a while with no particular agenda. It was a warm morning, overcast, the kind of sky that holds the light diffused and even no shadows. A mockingbird was doing its catalog of borrowed songs somewhere in the trees to the east. I had brought nothing, no flowers, no object. Just myself in the quiet, doing the thing you do when you want to be somewhere near a person who is no longer somewhere to be near. I thought about the last conversation, his hand around mine, his eyes checking whether I actually understood. I thought about the gold chain I had worn for 7 years, the one with the pendant his first assistant had told me he'd chosen himself a small, flat disc with no image on the front. I had never looked at the back until the night of the Christmas dinner, when I'd stood in the dark bedroom before Marcus fell asleep and turned it over in the ambient light from the window. The engraving was small. 8 words his handwriting replicated in the thin, careful lines of a jeweler's tool. "You were always the right one, G." He had given it to me at our first Christmas 4 months after I married his son. I had worn it every day since, without knowing what it said on the back. Without knowing that it had been from the beginning something more than a gift. I stood at his grave, and I thought he was building the foundation before I knew I would need one. I stayed for 20 minutes. On the drive home, I stopped at a farmer's market on Ralph David Abernathy and bought tomatoes and a bunch of basil and a small jar of honey from a vendor who told me the bees were kept in Decatur, which I found, for reasons I could not entirely explain, genuinely comforting. The chain is on my desk now, not around my neck. I took it off the morning after Christmas and placed it in the small leather box it came in, and I have not put it back on, not because I no longer want it, because what it was while I wore it, a piece of jewelry with a private message I didn't know existed, is not what it is now that I know. Now it is something I look at, something I hold sometimes when I am sitting at my desk in the morning light, turning it between my fingers, feeling the slight raised texture of the engraving on the back. Some things are better held than worn. Some truths are better carried than displayed. Patricia and I had lunch in May. Not a professional meeting, she had suggested it, and it was the suggestion of a woman stepping sideways out of a professional role into something more like a friendship, a lateral move I welcomed. We ate at a place in Ponce City Market outdoors, the Atlanta spring, doing the thing it does in May before the heat arrives and makes everything serious again. She told me about a case she was beginning, something complicated involving a family business and 3 generations of bad documentation. I told her about the new clients, the repainted study, the tomatoes I had put in pots on the back deck. At one point she said, "Lenny, most people in your position spend the first year angry." I thought about that. "I think I did my anger early," I said, "while I was still gathering information. By the time there was anything to do with it, it had converted into something more useful." She nodded. She picked up her glass. "What did it convert into?" she asked. I considered the question honestly, the way I try to consider questions that deserve honest answers. "Clarity," I said. And then eventually something like patience with myself, for having taken as long as I took to see what was in front of me. "You saw it," Patricia said. "That's the part that matters." "Gerald saw it first," I said. She smiled. "Then you were both paying attention. The house in Cascade Heights is quieter now than it was during the years when it was nominally full. I have come to understand that the quiet is not absence. It is what the house actually sounds like when it is being used for what it is, a place to work, to rest, to think, to sit in the backyard on a warm evening and listen to the neighborhood going about its life around the perimeter of my own. The oak trees drop their leaves in November and come back in April, and the yard cycles through its seasons with the reliable, unceremonious consistency of things that are rooted and therefore do not require your attention to continue. I am 37 years old. I have a practice I built from nothing that now manages more than I would have projected at 25. I have a house that is mine, in every sense of that word. I have 2 oak trees and tomatoes in pots on the back deck and a jar of Decatur honey on the kitchen counter. I have a leather box on my desk with a gold chain in it that says 8 words on the back that a quiet man had engraved there before he gave it to me, trusting that I would eventually turn it over. I have the specific kind of life that does not announce itself. Gerald would have recognized it immediately. A note before I go. I am not telling you this story because I want you to admire what I did. I did not do anything extraordinary. I paid attention. I was patient. I did not move before I was ready. I trusted that the truth, if I documented it carefully and protected it well, would eventually be in a room where it could do what it needed to do. What I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all, is something simpler than strategy and more durable than revenge. The people who underestimate you are giving you a gift. They are showing you their cards while they think they are watching yours. Every assumption they make about what you will do, that you will react, that you will confront, that you will be too emotional or too slow or too trusting to see what is happening, is a gap through which a prepared person can walk without breaking stride. You do not have to announce your strength. You do not have to perform your knowing. You simply have to know and be willing to wait for the moment when the knowing becomes the room. Some tables are set for abundance. Some tables are set for something else. Learn to tell the difference before you sit down. And if you ever find yourself at the wrong table, remember that the door you came in through is not the only way the evening can end. Stay rooted, stay ready, and never ever let anyone rewrite what was always yours.